I was 7 when I became an orphan and a servant in the same afternoon. The plane went down over the Atlantic. A mechanical failure, they said later, something about a fuel line that shouldn't have failed but did. My parents were flying back from a conference in London. My father was a cardiologist, my mother an architect. They were the kind of people who made lists and kept schedules and had a 5-year plan that included a little brother or sister for me. They were not the kind of people who died in plane crashes. But the world doesn't sort its tragedies by suitability. I remember the funeral in fragments. The smell of lilies, which I still can't tolerate. The pressure of too many hands on my shoulders, each one saying "I'm so sorry" like it was a password they needed to unlock their own grief. And Martha, my mother's younger sister, arriving in black silk and perfect mascara, already positioning herself as my savior. "Poor Sophie," she said, kneeling to my level in the church vestibule. Her perfume was thick, floral, nothing like my mother's clean scent of lavender and pencil shavings. "No child should lose both parents, but you're lucky, darling, you have me." I didn't feel lucky. I felt like a package that had been misdelivered, and Martha was the neighbor who had decided to keep it rather than return to sender. She was 43 then, childless, married to Harold, a man who managed investments from a home office and drank gin starting at 4 p.m. She had never been close to my mother. I knew this because my mother had told me once, in the careful way adults discuss family fractures. "Martha and I are very different people, sweetheart. She sees the world as a competition, and she needs to win. Your aunt sees love as a limited resource. I see it as infinite. That's why we don't spend much time together." I wish I had remembered that conversation sooner. I wish I had understood that Martha didn't see me as a niece to love, but as an asset to acquire. The lawyers saw a charitable woman taking in her orphan niece. The judge saw a stable home, a married couple, a child who needed family. I saw Martha measuring my mother's curtains while the estate attorney read the will. My parents' house was a Victorian in the old part of town, 4 stories, a wraparound porch, a garden my mother had designed herself with native plants and hidden benches for reading. I had grown up there, learned to walk on those creaking stairs, fallen asleep to the sound of rain on the metal roof. It was the only home I knew. Martha moved in 3 weeks after the funeral. She brought her own furniture, her own art, her own sense of what a house should be. My mother's watercolor landscapes came down from the walls and went into storage. Martha's oil paintings of French vineyards went up. My father's leather chairs, the ones that smelled like pipe tobacco and medical journals, were relegated to the basement. Martha's velvet settees, the color of dried blood, took their place in the living room. "Change is healthy," Martha told me, watching the movers carry my parents' bed out of the master suite. "We can't live in the past, Sophie. Your mother would want you to be happy, not moping around in a museum." I wanted to tell her that my mother would want me to remember her. That happiness, for a 7-year-old, didn't require the erasure of everything that came before. But I was 7, and Martha was an adult, and adults were supposed to know things I didn't. Harold was invisible in those first months. He stayed in his office, emerged for dinner, drank his gin, and retreated again. He never spoke to me directly, never asked about my day, never offered the kind of awkward kindness that strangers sometimes extend to grieving children. He was a ghost with a drinking problem, and I learned to navigate around him the way you learn to avoid furniture in a dark room. The changes came gradually, like water wearing down stone. First, my bedroom, the one at the end of the hall, with windows overlooking the garden and my mother's books still on the shelves, became too large for one little girl. Martha moved me to a room near the kitchen, originally the maid's quarters, with a single window that faced the driveway and smelled of dryer vents. "It's cozier," she said. "More practical, and you'll be closer to help with chores." I was 7. I didn't know what chores were, except that they involved a small checklist Martha taped to my door each morning: make bed, fold laundry, set table, clear dishes. I thought this was normal. I thought all children had checklists. I thought Martha was teaching me responsibility, the way my parents had taught me to tie my shoes or say please. By 8, the checklist had grown: dust the living room, vacuum the stairs, water the plants, the ones Martha had brought, not my mother's native garden, which was allowed to wither while I tended imported orchids in climate-controlled humidity. By 9, I was cooking simple meals under Martha's supervision. "A girl should know her way around a kitchen," she said, though she never cooked herself. She sat at the island with a glass of wine and corrected my technique. "Too much salt, not enough butter. The onions should be translucent, not browned. Start over. I started over. I always started over. I was a child who had lost everything, and Martha was the only adult who had stayed. I told myself that her criticism was care, that her demands were lessons, that the exhaustion in my small body at the end of each day was the price of having a home. I didn't know about the money. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories. If you're new here, my name is Sophie, and this is the story of how I stopped being a guest in my own house and became its owner. If you've ever had someone take everything from you and call it charity, if you've ever been made to feel grateful for your own exploitation, subscribe. This one's for you. Here's my story. I was 10 when Martha pulled me into the study, her study now. My father's medical texts replaced by Martha's accounting ledgers and fashion magazines. She sat me in a chair too big for me and opened a leather-bound book with the gravity of a judge delivering a sentence. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. I shook my head. "This is the household ledger. It tracks every expense, food, electricity, your clothes, your school supplies. Do you know how much it costs to raise a child, Sophie?" I didn't. I had never thought about it. My parents had never discussed money in front of me. Money was something that existed like gravity or weather, a force of nature that required no explanation. "More than you can imagine," Martha said, flipping pages filled with numbers I couldn't read. "Your parents left some money, of course, but it's not infinite. And Harold's investments haven't been performing well. Do you understand what that means?" I understood that she was unhappy. I understood that I was the cause. I understood with the instinctive guilt of children everywhere that my existence was expensive and inconvenient and somehow my fault. "It means," Martha continued, "that you need to contribute, that you need to earn your keep. Do you know what happens to girls who don't earn their keep?" I shook my head again, smaller this time. "They go to orphanages, state homes, places where 20 children share one bathroom and the food comes from cans. Is that what you want?" "No," I whispered. "Then be grateful," she said, closing the book with a snap. "Be grateful you have a home. Be grateful Harold and I took you in when no one else wanted you. Be grateful I don't send you away." She didn't send me away. She sent me to the local public school instead of the private academy my parents had chosen, a 40-minute bus ride each way through neighborhoods that grew progressively less familiar. "The tuition was excessive," she said. "You'll get a perfectly adequate education here, and you'll have more time for household responsibilities." The responsibilities expanded to fill every gap in my schedule. I woke at 5 to make breakfast for Martha and Harold: eggs, bacon, toast, coffee exactly as Martha preferred, Harold's orange juice freshly squeezed. I caught the bus at 7, spent 8 hours in classrooms where I struggled to stay awake, returned at 4 to start dinner, clean, do laundry, help Harold with his coat and slippers when he emerged from his office. I fell asleep at 9, sometimes 10, my hands chapped from dish soap, my shoulders aching from carrying laundry baskets up 4 flights of stairs. On weekends, I gardened. Martha had replaced my mother's native plants with formal hedges and rose beds that required constant pruning. I worked in sun and rain, developing calluses that never fully healed, a farmer's tan that marked me as labor rather than leisure. Martha inspected my work with the same critical eye she applied to my cooking. "Missed a weed. Uneven edges. The roses need more fertilizer. Don't you know anything?" I didn't know anything. That was the lesson I learned most thoroughly. I didn't know how to be a daughter because my parents were dead. I didn't know how to be a niece because Martha had redefined the role into something unrecognizable. I didn't know how to be a child because childhood was a luxury I could no longer afford. What I knew was work. What I knew was exhaustion. What I knew was the precise weight of a laundry basket full of wet towels, the exact temperature of Harold's coffee, the specific angle at which Martha preferred her pillows fluffed. I knew, most of all, that I was in debt, that every meal I ate, every shirt I wore, every breath I took in that house was a loan I would never repay. Martha reminded me weekly, monthly, whenever I moved too slowly or spoke too quietly or failed to anticipate her needs. "Do you know what an orphanage costs the state?" she would ask, not expecting an answer. "Less than I'm spending on you. Remember that, Sophie. Remember what you owe." I remembered. I wrote it in my head like a ledger I could never balance, a debt that grew with every passing day. I was 12 when I found the first evidence that something was wrong. It was accidental. I was dusting the study, reaching behind the desk to clean a baseboard, and my hand brushed against a folder that had slipped into the gap. I shouldn't have opened it. I knew I shouldn't have opened it. But I was 12 and curious and desperately hungry for any information about my parents that Martha hadn't destroyed. The folder contained bank statements. Not Martha's, my parents'. Accounts I didn't know existed, with balances that made my eyes blur with zeros. Trust funds, investment portfolios, real estate holdings. My parents had been wealthy, not comfortable, not well off. Wealthy in a way that meant I should have had a future secured, an education guaranteed, a life that didn't involve scrubbing floors at 5 in the morning. The statements showed monthly transfers to an account I recognized, the household account Martha used for groceries and utilities. But the amounts were enormous. Thousands of dollars each month, far more than our expenses could justify. And there were other transfers, larger ones, to accounts I didn't recognize. I didn't understand what I was seeing. I was 12, with no financial literacy, no context for the numbers that danced before my eyes. But I understood that Martha had lied. That the story of poverty and sacrifice she told me was not the whole story. That somewhere, in the space between what she said and what these papers showed, there was a truth I needed to find. I put the folder back. I finished dusting. I said nothing. But I started paying attention. I started listening at doors, reading over shoulders, collecting fragments of information like a magpie collecting shiny objects. I learned that Martha received a monthly payment labeled guardian stipend from a trust company, a payment for my care that was separate from my parents' estate. I learned that she sold my mother's jewelry, piece by piece, to a dealer in the city. I learned that Harold's investments were mostly losses, but that Martha's personal account grew steadily regardless. I learned, most importantly, that I was not poor, that my parents had left me enough to live comfortably, to study, to build a life, and that Martha was taking it, piece by piece, while telling me I should be grateful for the crumbs. I was 13 when I started documenting. I stole a notebook from the school supply closet. I couldn't ask Martha for one, couldn't explain why I needed it, and began keeping my own records. Dates of jewelry sales I overheard. Amounts from bank statements I glimpsed. Conversations between Martha and her lawyer about the trust, and Sophie's majority and contingency plans. I wrote in code in case the notebook was found. I hid it in the lining of my mattress, the one place Martha never checked because servants' quarters didn't merit inspection. I wrote at night, by the light of a stolen flashlight, my hand cramping around a pencil stub I'd found in Harold's desk. I didn't know what I would do with the information. I didn't have a plan, a goal, a vision of justice. I just knew that documenting the truth was the only power I had, the only resistance available to a child who was not allowed to resist openly. I was 14 when Martha found me reading in the garden instead of weeding. She didn't scream, Martha never screamed. She spoke softly, precisely, the way she always did when she was most dangerous. "Do you know what happens to lazy girls?" she asked. I stood, brushing dirt from my knees. I was taking a break. "I'll finish the weeding. Lazy girls end up on the street," Martha continued as if I hadn't spoken. "No skills, no references, no family, just another homeless statistic. Is that what you want?" "No," I said. You were just avoiding your responsibilities again." She stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, the wine on her breath. "Let me explain something, Sophie, something I've been too kind to say before." She took my chin in her hand, not gently. "You are not special. You are not talented. You are not pretty enough or smart enough or charming enough to make your way in the world without help. The only reason you have a roof over your head is because I allow it. The only reason you eat is because I provide, and I am running out of patience with your entitlement." She released me with a small push. "No dinner tonight, and you'll finish the garden in the dark. Maybe that will teach you gratitude." I finished the garden by flashlight, the same one I used for my secret writing. My stomach ached with hunger. My hands bled from thorns I couldn't see, and I made a decision, there in the dark among my mother's dying plants, that I would not be grateful, that I would not be taught, that I would find a way out, or I would make one. I was 15 when I met Mrs. Patterson. She was the school librarian, a woman in her 60s with gray braids and reading glasses on a chain. She noticed me because I was the only student who came to the library during lunch, who stayed after school until the bus left, who read everything, fiction, history, law, finance, with the desperation of someone trying to understand a world that had been hidden from her. "You read like you're studying for an exam," she said one afternoon, settling into the chair across from my table. "I am," I said. "An exam I don't know the date of." She didn't ask what I meant. She just nodded, pulled out a book of her own, and read in companionable silence. We did this for weeks, months. She never asked about my home life, never commented on my worn clothes or my exhaustion or the way I flinched at loud noises. She just provided space and books and the occasional recommendation. Try this one, she said, sliding a book across the table. Asterisk the Law of Trusts and Estates. Asterisk might be useful for your exam. I read it in 3 days. Then I read it again, taking notes in my secret code. I learned about fiduciary duties, about guardian accountability, about the legal obligations of trustees. I learned that Martha was not just cruel, she was criminal. That every month she took money from my trust without ensuring my welfare, she was violating her legal duty. That every piece of my mother's jewelry she sold without court approval was theft. That the guardian stipend she collected was contingent on my actual care, not my exploitation. I was 16 when I showed Mrs. Patterson my notebook. I shouldn't have. It was a risk, a vulnerability, an exposure of the only secret I had. But I was tired of carrying it alone, tired of the weight of truth that no one else could see. And Mrs. Patterson had never betrayed me, never demanded anything, never made me feel small. She read the notebook in silence, her face changing from curiosity to concern to something that looked like fury, carefully controlled. "How old are you?" she asked when she finished. 16. 2 years until majority. 2 years until you can access your trust directly, sue for accounting, demand justice. She closed the notebook, handed it back. "Can you survive 2 more years?" "I don't know," I said, honest for the first time with anyone. "I'm so tired." "I know," she said, "but you're also strong, stronger than you know, and you have something Martha doesn't have." "What?" "Time. She's 62, Sophie. She's been stealing for 9 years, building a life on your back, and in 2 years you can take it all back. Not just the money, the house, the history, the right to exist in your own story." She reached across the table, touched my hand briefly. "Survive, document, plan. And when the time comes, strike precisely. Martha thinks you're a child. Make sure you're a woman she never saw coming." I survived, I documented, I planned, and I found the letter. It was in Martha's desk in a folder marked estate planning, which I accessed during one of her rare absences, a charity luncheon that kept her away for 4 hours. The letter was from her lawyer, dated 6 months prior, and it discussed options for early emancipation of a ward. Asterisk as Sophie's 17th birthday approaches, asterisk the lawyer wrote, asterisk we should consider petitioning for early termination of guardianship. If Sophie can be declared emancipated, or, alternatively, if she consents to a voluntary placement in an independent living program, the remaining trust assets would transfer to your direct control without the oversight currently required by the court. Given the challenges of the current arrangement, this may be the most efficient path forward. Asterisk I read it 3 times. Then I sat on the floor of the study, my back against my father's old desk, and I understood that Martha was not just stealing from me. She was planning to discard me, to declare me emancipated at 17, push me out into the world with nothing, and keep everything that remained. She was going to finish what the plane crash started. She was going to make me an orphan twice over. I put the letter back. I finished my chores. I smiled at dinner and said thank you when Martha passed the salt, and I began planning in earnest. I was 17 when I made my first move. It was small, almost invisible. I asked Martha if I could get a part-time job to learn responsibility, I said, and contribute to the household. She agreed, relieved at the prospect of reducing my expenses in her ledger. She didn't know that I had chosen the job carefully. A filing clerk at a law firm 3 bus rides away, chosen because the senior partner specialized in trust litigation. I worked Saturdays, sorting files, making coffee, learning the rhythms of a profession I intended to join. I was quiet, efficient, forgettable, the same strategy I used at home, now deployed in a world that might actually help me. I listened to phone calls about fiduciary breaches, about guardian malfeasance, about the legal remedies available to wards who had been exploited. And I met Mr. Castellanos. He was 70, semi-retired, the kind of lawyer who had seen every variation of human cruelty and still believed in the law's capacity to correct it. He found me reading a case file I should have been filing, a guardian who had embezzled from a disabled ward. And instead of reprimanding me, he sat down and asked what I was doing there. I told him, not everything. I was still careful, still guarded, still trained by Martha to believe that revealing weakness invited attack. But I told him enough. That I was a ward, that my guardian was my aunt, that I suspected financial mismanagement but had no proof, no access, no way to challenge her without destroying the only home I had. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "How old are you?" 17. 1 year until majority. 1 year until you can demand a full accounting, sue for breach of fiduciary duty, recover what was stolen. He leaned forward, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. But if what you suspect is true, if she's planning early emancipation, if she's been selling assets without court approval, you don't need to wait. You can petition the court now, as a minor of sufficient maturity with evidence of wrongdoing. I don't have evidence, I said. Not the kind that would hold up, just a notebook, observations, hunches. Then get evidence, he said. Legally, carefully. Document everything she does from this moment forward, bank statements, asset sales, communications with her lawyer, and bring it to me in 6 months. If it's solid, I'll take your case. Pro bono. Why? I asked. Why would you help me? He smiled, a rare expression that softened his severe face. Because 50 years ago, I was a ward too, because someone helped me when I had nothing. And because, he tapped the case file I had been reading, I have a particular dislike of people who steal from children while calling it care. I worked for him for 6 more months. I learned to file properly, to research case law, to draft simple motions. And I continued documenting Martha's crimes, now with the knowledge of what would constitute legal proof. What would persuade a judge? What would survive scrutiny? I photocopied bank statements when Martha left them on her desk. I recorded conversations on a cheap digital recorder I bought with my first paycheck. I compiled a timeline of jewelry sales, matching Martha's trips to the city with transactions from my parents' estate account. By my 18th birthday, I had a file box full of evidence, and I had a lawyer who believed me. The petition was filed on my birthday. I chose the date deliberately, the same day I gained legal majority, the same day Martha's control officially ended, the same day I could finally act without her permission. She didn't see it coming. She had spent the previous month planning my emancipation, a party, she called it, a celebration of my independence. She had found me an apartment, she said, a small studio across town. She had arranged for a job reference, a modest stipend, a clean break from the difficult years of my adolescence. She didn't know that I had already broken, that I had spent the night before my birthday in Mr. Castellanos's office, signing documents that would change everything, that the process server was scheduled to arrive at the house at noon, while Martha was hosting her bridge club in the parlor. I was there when he arrived. I opened the door myself, wearing the only nice dress I owned, one I had bought with my own money, one Martha had never seen. I took the envelope from the process server and carried it to the parlor, where 12 women in pastel suits were arranging cards and pouring tea. Martha, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. This is for you. She took the envelope automatically, her hostess smile still fixed on her face. Then she read the first page, and the smile cracked. She read the second page, and the color drained from her carefully maintained complexion. She read the third page, and she looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in 11 years. What is this? She whispered. A petition for accounting, I said. A demand for restitution of misappropriated trust assets. A lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, and fraud. I paused, enjoying the silence, the 12 pairs of eyes fixed on us, the moment I had imagined 1,000 times in the dark hours of my childhood. Happy birthday to me. The bridge club left quickly, murmuring excuses, already texting their friends about the scandal. Martha remained frozen in her chair, the papers trembling in her hands. You can't do this, she said, but her voice was uncertain, the first crack in the armor of control she had maintained for a decade. I took you in. I raised you. I sacrificed. You stole from me. You sold my mother's jewelry. You collected a guardian stipend while making me work as your servant. You planned to emancipate me at 17 and keep everything that was mine. You told me I should be grateful, and I'm done being grateful. I turned to leave. She grabbed my wrist, her nails digging into the skin. You'll lose, she hissed. I have lawyers, I have connections. I have a life in this community, and you're nothing, a foster brat with delusions of grandeur. No one will believe you. I looked down at her hand on my wrist, the same hand that had pushed me into labor, that had pointed out my failures, that had taken everything while telling me I owed her my existence. Let go, I said quietly, or I'll add assault to the petition. She let go. I walked out of the parlor, out of the house, out of the life she had constructed on my back. I didn't look back. I had spent 11 years looking back, looking down, looking anywhere but at the truth. Now I looked forward, and the future was bright and terrifying and finally mine. The trial lasted 4 months. Martha fought viciously, spending my money on lawyers who attacked my character, my credibility, my mental stability. They painted me as an ungrateful child, a disturbed adolescent, a fantasist who had invented abuse to justify her rebellion. But I had evidence. I had Mr. Castellanos, who presented my documentation with the precision of a surgeon. I had Mrs. Patterson, who testified about my condition when I arrived at school, the exhaustion and the fear and the desperate reading. I had bank records, transaction histories, the testimony of the jewelry dealer who had bought my mother's pieces from Martha at fraction of their value. And I had the ledger. Martha's own ledger, which I had photographed page by page, showing the expenses she claimed against my trust, expenses that included her wardrobe, her vacations, her car payments, her bridge club dues. She had documented her own crimes with the thoroughness of a bureaucrat, never imagining that the child she taught to be grateful would one day learn to be angry. The judgment was devastating. The court found that Martha had misappropriated over $800,000 in trust assets, plus the value of sold property, plus punitive damages for fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The total exceeded $2 million, more than Martha had, more than she could ever repay. She declared bankruptcy within the month. Harold, finally visible, finally acting, filed for divorce and moved to Florida with a woman half his age. The house, my parents' house, the Victorian with the wraparound porch and the garden I had tended and killed and tended again, went into foreclosure. I could have taken the money. Mr. Castellanos urged me to invest it, build a life, forget the past. But I didn't want the money, not primarily, I wanted the house. I wanted to stand on that porch and know that I belonged there, not as a servant or a ward or a grateful orphan, but as an owner, as a survivor, as myself. I waited. I watched the foreclosure proceedings, the auction notices, the declining bids as the market softened and Martha's debts mounted. I saved my salary from the law firm, where Mr. Castellanos had hired me as a paralegal after the trial. I built my credit, established my finances, prepared. The auction was held on a Tuesday in March, in a conference room at the county courthouse. 5 bidders appeared, mostly developers looking to subdivide the property, to tear down the Victorian and build condos, to erase the last physical evidence of my childhood. I was the 6th bidder. I sat in the back, dressed in a suit I had bought for the occasion, my hands folded in my lap. The bidding started low, stalled, rose in increments of 10,000. The developers dropped out one by one, deterred by the property's age, its maintenance needs, its location in a neighborhood that had declined since my parents' time. I bid the last increment myself. $340,000, less than the house was worth, less than Martha had stolen from me in a single year, less than the price of my childhood, but more than I had ever imagined spending on anything. The gavel fell. The house was mine. I didn't move in immediately. I spent 2 weeks walking through empty rooms, deciding what to keep and what to discard. Martha's velvet settees went to charity. Harold's gin bottles went to recycling. The orchids, the formal hedges, the imported furniture, all sold, all removed, all erased. I found my mother's watercolors in the basement, wrapped in newspaper, undamaged by a decade of neglect. I hung them in the living room, where Martha's oil paintings had been. I found my father's leather chairs, musty but intact, and brought them upstairs. I found photographs, my parents' wedding, my first birthday, family vacations to places I barely remembered, and I placed them on the mantel, where Martha had kept her porcelain figurines. And I found, in the attic, a box of my mother's garden designs. Native plants, she had written in the margins. Low maintenance. Drought-resistant, for Sophie, who loves to watch things grow. I replanted the garden that spring. Not Martha's formal hedges, but my mother's vision, wildflowers and native grasses, hidden benches and bird feeders, a space that invited sitting rather than working. I hired a landscaper to do the heavy work, then spent weekends refining, pruning, learning to tend rather than toil. I was 24 when I went to evict Martha. She had been living in the house since the foreclosure, refusing to leave, fighting eviction proceedings with the same viciousness she had applied to my lawsuit. But the law was clear now, the ownership undisputed. I arrived with a moving company, a locksmith, and a court order that gave her until 6 p.m. to vacate. She opened the door herself. No Harold to hide behind, no bridge club to perform for. Just Martha, 65 now, her silver hair grown out, her perfect bob replaced by something unkempt and gray. She wore a bathrobe at 2 in the afternoon. She smelled of wine and something sour, a body that had stopped caring for itself. "Sophie," she said, and her voice was the same soft, precise, dangerous. "Come to gloat." "I've come to take possession of my property," I said. "You have until 6. The movers will pack whatever you want to take. Everything else stays." "This is my home," she said, but the words lacked conviction, the certainty that had sustained her through 11 years of exploitation. "I raised you here. I gave you everything. You gave me labor," I said. "You gave me debt. You gave me a childhood of exhaustion and fear and the belief that I owed you my existence." I stepped closer, close enough to smell her decay, to see the broken capillaries in her nose, the tremor in her hands. "But you also gave me something else, Martha. You gave me practice. 11 years of learning to survive, to document, to plan, to wait. You made me patient. You made me precise. You made me the woman who could take everything back." I handed her a box, cardboard, unmarked, the kind she had used to store my mother's things in the basement. "Your personal effects," I said. "Clothes, documents, toiletries, and this." I placed a framed photograph on top of the box. My parents on their wedding day, smiling at a future they didn't know would end in the Atlantic. A photograph Martha had hidden in the attic, that I had found during my restoration, that I had kept for this moment. "I thought you might want it," I said. "Since you spent so long trying to erase them, you can look at them now in your new home and remember what you took." She looked at the photograph, then at me. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, not remorse exactly, but recognition. The understanding that she had created me, shaped me, forged me in the fire of her own cruelty, and that the weapon she had forged was now pointed at her. "I should have sent you to that orphanage," she whispered. "Yes," I agreed. "You should have, because then I would have been someone else's problem. Someone else's story. Instead, I'm yours, and I'm not going anywhere." She left at 5:30, before the deadline, before the movers could touch her things. She carried the box herself, refusing help, her back straight with the last remnants of dignity. I watched her walk to the taxi I had called, place the box in the trunk, slide into the back seat without looking back. I didn't watch the taxi drive away. I turned to the house, my parents' house, the house where I had been servant and ward and finally, owner. I walked through the rooms I had restored, past the photographs I had placed, into the garden my mother had designed. I sat on a bench I had built myself, among flowers I had planted myself, and I waited for the feeling I had expected. Triumph, satisfaction. The sweet taste of revenge finally consumed. It didn't come. Instead, I felt something quieter, something deeper, something that had been waiting for me to stop fighting long enough to receive it. Peace. Not happiness, I was too tired for happiness, too scarred for simple joy. But peace. The knowledge that I was home, that I belonged, that no one could take this from me because I had taken it myself. A neighbor appeared at the garden gate, a woman my age, with a toddler on her hip and a plate of cookies in her hand. "Hi," she said, hesitant. "I'm Jenna, from next door. I saw the moving truck and I thought, we never really met Martha. She wasn't very friendly, but I wanted to welcome the new owner." "Thank you," I said, taking a cookie. It was still warm chocolate chip, slightly burnt at the edges. "I'm Sophie. Are you okay?" she asked, looking at me with the directness of someone who hadn't learned to look away from pain. "You look like you've been through something." I laughed, surprising myself. "You could say that. I grew up here actually, a long time ago. I'm just coming home." She nodded, not pressing, not demanding the story I wasn't ready to tell. "Well, welcome back. If you need anything, sugar, a cup of flour, someone to complain about the HOA with, I'm next door. Most days anyway. My mom helps with the kids." "Thank you," I said again and meant it. "I might take you up on that." She left, the toddler waving over her shoulder. I ate the cookie on the bench in the garden in the home that was finally mine. And I understood with the clarity that only comes after long struggle that revenge was not the point. The point was this, the cookie, the garden, the neighbor who didn't know my history and didn't need to. The point was building something new on the foundation of something stolen, something reclaimed, something finally earned. I finished the cookie. I went inside and I began to live. I am Sophie Brennan. I am 24 years old. I own a house, a history, a future I am still learning to imagine. I have a job I love, a garden that grows without my exhaustion, and a small studio in the former servants' quarters where I paint portraits of children who were made to work before they were allowed to be young. I am not healed. I still flinch at loud noises, still wake at 5 expecting a checklist, still sometimes feel the phantom weight of debt that was never mine. But I am home. And for the first time in my life, That word means what it should. See you in the next story.